We know that sometimes technology troubles happen. There is a list of common challenges on Get Involved Kingston, including if your audio or video aren't working. You can also adjust your view options so that you can see both the presentation and the members of the project team at the same time. If your internet connection goes down, you can call into the meeting at the number on this screen. Please write it down just in case. The number is 647-558-0588, and the meeting ID is 894-7414-8556. We will do our best to help you with technical problems, but sometimes the easiest way to resolve issues is to log out of Zoom and rejoin the meeting. You can also do that using your registration confirmation email. If you have a question at any point during the session, please use the chat feature. It can be found on the bar across the bottom of the screen. To ask a question, type into the chat area. If time allows, we will also have an opportunity to ask questions near the end of the session. During this Q&A, you will also have the option to raise your hand to speak and ask a question. To do this, please use the raise hand function that can be accessed by clicking reactions and selecting the raise hand. I'll be monitoring for the raised hands and will acknowledge you and ask you to turn on your microphone to ask your question or share your comment. We'll be working to answer your questions in the chat or as part of the Q&A, but please note that if we don't answer your questions today, we will publish the answers as part of our reporting out document on the Get Involved Kingston project page. On your screen, you'll see the guidelines for participation today. If you've joined us before for an engagement session, they might look familiar to you. These guidelines for participation were developed as part of the city's public engagement framework and to make sure that we can all join together and be respectful and open to ideas. I'm going to leave this up for about 30 seconds so you have an opportunity to read them. If there's any concerns for the guidelines to participation, please let me know by using the raise hand function. Well, thank you. I see no objections to the guidelines for participation, so we'll proceed into the online engagement session following these guidelines. So now for today's agenda, we're going to start off with a welcome and an overview and explanation about participatory budgeting provided by Desiree Kennedy, the city's Chief Financial Officer and Treasurer. Next, we have two presentations planned. The first by Ryan Hagee, Director of Financial Planning and Reporting for the City of Kitchener, and next by Melinda Jolly, Citizen Engagement Coordinator for the City of Victoria. Following the presentation, we will begin our breakout sessions. We will automatically assign you to groups, and I will share some instructions before we move into those sessions. When you're finished your breakout sessions, you'll return to the main meeting and we'll share the session themes identified in the breakout rooms and move into our wrap-up and a brief Q&A. Thank you, everyone. I'm now going to pass this presentation over to Desiree.
Thanks, Nancy. So welcome to everybody today. Thanks for sharing your lunchtime with us as we have some discussion about participatory budgeting and what that means for the City of Kingston. I just also want to recognize we have our Director of Financial Services, Lana Foles, on the line with us, supporting the event. And you will be meeting later with our breakout room, some of our financial services team. Scarlett, Monica, Emily, and Melanie are on board here to help us out. And then thanks to our communications team who are hosting the event today and helping us with all the blips and things that we always seem to encounter when we do these sessions. So thanks everybody and welcome to those that are joining us. I'm just going to do a very brief overview and then turn it over to our special guests today. So why participatory budgeting? Some of you may be aware, we've sort of been on a path with respect to budget engagement over the last 3 or so years. Participatory budgeting came up as a topic at council back in 2020 when we started talking about expanding our budget engagement process. It's becoming increasingly common as a way to engage and empower residents. And so as part of the plan that we put in front of council back in 2020, a multi-year budget engagement plan, part of that in phase 3 of the plan, which is now, was for staff to explore the feasibility of implementing some type of participatory budgeting in Kingston. And so that brings us to today. Our 2023 budget engagement plan included the introduction of the concept of participatory budgeting, a focus on trying to determine a common definition for that, and then to identify opportunities for participatory budgeting for the City of Kingston. The feedback that we get today and feedback subsequent to this will go back to the new council. I expect part of our 2024 budget engagement process, there will be an element of this back to council with some recommendations of how potentially we could use participatory budgeting. So looking forward to the feedback from the folks today, and hopefully our collaborative brainstorming exercise will come up with some great ideas of how we can implement that. Next slide, please. So just very quickly, you're going to hear today 2 very different examples of participatory budgeting. And we did provide in a document we sent last Friday to the participants a number of other links to other examples, just to give you a bit of a feel of what others are doing across Canada and even across North America. You'll see some varieties, but no matter what type of theme is used, participatory budgeting certainly involves a few common elements. You'll hear it's a community-led engagement process. It's not a municipal-led or a city-led. It's actually a community-led process where community members get to share ideas, develop proposals, vote on those proposals, and implement those proposals. So a real empowerment exercise where citizens get to make spending decisions in areas that would benefit them. It is based on some predetermined objectives. So there would be an objective, and you'll hear that today, or a theme that's set forth in terms of what we're trying to accomplish, along with some funding parameters. But after that, it's really turned over to the community in terms of that. Next slide, please. So I think you'll see this maybe a couple times today in the presentations in terms of how participatory budgeting works. Certainly there's the first step in terms of designing the process, brainstorming the ideas, developing proposals, voting on those proposals, and then obviously funding and implementing the winning projects. Next slide, please. So I think that's it for me. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Ryan and Melinda. Ryan Hagee is here with us. He's the Director of Financial Planning and Reporting for the City of Kitchener. And Melinda Jolly is here from the City of Victoria. She's the Citizen Engagement Coordinator. So, and we thank Melinda for being here. I think she's 3 hours behind us, so she's just starting her day. But we're going to start off with Ryan. So Ryan, thank you for being here, and I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be a part of this and telling you about our experience at the City of Kitchener with participatory budgeting. Next slide, please. I won't go over the definition. I agree with kind of the high level version that Desiree has pointed out in her presentation about what it is, and it really has to go with getting people more involved and directly involved with the outcome for a project. So next slide. There's a few reasons why we do it. I've got them listed up on screen here. So from the technical side of things, why you would do it is to have more community engagement. Improving accountability and trust is a big one, because the people that are voting on things are directly determining what the outcome of something is, as opposed to a more traditional thing where the government would say, this is what we want to do, and maybe check in with people. But this is very different to that. It promotes cooperation, getting more people involved, helping people understand our processes and what have you. Likewise, for us at Kitchener, the reason we did it was it came up from our council's strategic discussions and business planning. They wanted to try it, and so we did. And over the next few slides, I'll tell you kind of what our experience was. Next slide. For us, we didn't have any in-house expertise about PB, or participatory budgeting. So we went to the University of Waterloo, which is right next door to us, and they do have people that are more involved in the kind of the research side of it, and we're very interested in having a practical demonstration of it to be involved. So we partnered with the University of Waterloo, and the city got expertise on it. The university got some research from it. So all in all, it was a win for us. We kind of, as notes here, went fairly slow. We ran 2 pilot projects just to figure out how things might work in the PB world at the City of Kitchener, and said we can learn from that, and then we could use that in future applications potentially. Next slide. So for us, we've honed in on 2 park projects. They're both of similar size, similar funding. They were already planned, so we knew we were going to do these parks, and each had a budget of approximately $100,000 to do it. The parks were different, though, in kind of their location and the makeup of the residents around them. We have the Sand Hills, which is more a downtown established area, Elmsdale Park, which is suburban and has a large immigrant community near it. So we wanted to test, you know, would it work in each community? Are there different hurdles that we would encounter, and what have you? So it was a good test environment for us in terms of running PB pilots. Next slide, please. So for us, process-wise, like Desiree had shown, there's kind of the normal path that PB takes. We generally followed that. So we had 3 stages, the first being idea generation. So we went out to the public and in those neighborhoods and said, what do you want to see in your park? What are some of the things you like about your park? What are some of the things you don't like? So ask some open-ended questions to get feedback, but then based on the feedback we got from that, we were able to group things together, and, you know, maybe poor lighting came up, or, you know, we need more active space or more passive space. So taking some of those, grouping them all together and having an idea of the types of things that people would want based on the feedback they've given us. And so from that, we developed different park elements. And so that could be, you know, play structures or swings or a garden or, you know, a chess table or a checkers table, you know, those types of things. And so that was the first piece in the idea generation. And then we moved on to idea prioritization. And so we took the feedback that we heard and went back out to the community and said, this is what we think we heard. Can you verify that? And so people looked at the different elements that were there and verified that, yeah, like some of these are more valid than others. We asked people to rank the different items that were on there and included some of the costing for those elements. So people might want, you know, a water slide in their park, but that wasn't within the budget. So we took those different elements, gave people an idea, said within the budget of $100,000, you know, try to build some of the elements. What elements would you like to see within that? And then the University of Waterloo took that, develop some bundles, again, based on the feedback. So we're kind of refining things, going from the big idea generation, bringing it down a little bit to, you know, what are some of the elements, and then finally bringing it down to bundles. And so there were 4 different bundles proposed in each park with different elements based on the feedback that we had heard from people. And then people were, at the end of it, voting for their favorite bundle, and whichever bundle won, that's what was getting built. So the University of Waterloo tallied all of that, and we came out with a winning design for each of the parks. Next slide, please. So overall, the outcome was that area residents were directly involved with all stages of the process and had full control over what the final outcome was. It's not like we were going to override them and say, no, that's not the best park. What we found that was interesting is that in both locations, the design that won was not one that was generated by staff. It was one that was generated by residents and their feedback. So in each case, there were 4 bundles that were proposed. 3 of them were based on kind of the high level information we had heard from residents, and 1 was put together by staff in each instance. And in both cases, a resident bundle won as opposed to a staff bundle. Next slide, please. So we have 5 different takeaways from this that we've put in the report that went back to council. First, like I just mentioned, was that participatory budgeting resulted in a different outcome. Again, in both cases, the park that got chosen was not the one that staff proposed. It was one of the ones that was built with elements that came from area residents. 2, we also found that PB was very labor intensive. We needed resources outside of just kind of the park landscape architects to run the process. So we needed essentially those staff to do the technical side of the elements and actually help being involved with building the park, but we needed other staff to run the process, the PB process. And so we had to leverage staff in other divisions as well as our University of Waterloo friends to help us with voting, coordinating all the meetings, getting residents to come out. That was especially one of the things we learned is that was a bit more difficult in the immigrant community. They were a bit more skeptical of government. And so it took a whole lot of extra care and effort from staff to get adequate feedback to say, this is the park that's going to be in your neighborhood for the next 10 or 20 years. Next slide, please. Likewise, doing the PB budget or PDB process took longer. As you can imagine, you go back to people multiple times. It takes longer to coordinate those meetings, to have lead time for it, to get the responses back, whatever. So it just overall takes a whole lot more time to do a fully engaged PB process. And we even heard that some people felt rushed in the grand scheme of things. Number 4, in both cases, our projects went over budget. There were a budget for $100,000. In both cases, they came in around $150,000. As noted here, kind of the additional staff time required needed to be charged somewhere. So it was a cost of those projects. Some of the elements needed to be added in addition to the PB elements. So there were things like, trash cans and, some park benches or whatever that were going to be put in. They were the right thing to put in that people hadn't voted on, but there was some cost to that. And one of the things that we also found in feedback was that people were surprised how expensive some pieces were. For instance, for a park bench, you can go and buy one at Costco for say $100 or $200, but for us, we're buying commercial grade things that are going to be in there for a while. They have to be accessible, so we have to put concrete pads down and what have you. So people were surprised at the cost of some elements. Next slide, please. Our final takeaway was about coordination, cooperation. It was a key. So like I've mentioned, we had our technical staff, the parks and cemetery staff that were running the project. We had communications helping with overall coordination and communication from the city side. We had our MP&S staff who were going out into the community, have connections with them, trying to get people involved, and the University of Waterloo staff. So it was a lot of coordination to come up with a good solution. Next slide, I think it's my final one. Overall, where we landed was council asked us to bring back a permanent funding solution for participatory budgeting as part of our 2020 budget process. Ultimately, our council chose not to continue with it. They found that the cost of it and the time of it, the solution at the end of it, they didn't think was worth all of that extra cost and time. Some councillors were saying, what, we could have built, like 3 parks for the price of 2 using this new method. And instead, they chose to invest in a few other areas that they thought they would get more bang for their buck, specifically in neighborhood areas and environmental initiatives. So when it came down to being compared with others, they chose not to fund it in 2020 budget. So it's been on hold essentially from them. I would say it's not dead, but it's just on pause for the time being. I believe that's the end of my slides. Yes. Right.
Hi, I'm Melinda Jolly from the City of Victoria. And I'm going to speak about the city has hosted 4 participatory budgeting processes. So we'll just jump right into them. Next slide, please. So council committed $50,000 as their first pilot PB process. And this same idea that we've been talking about this morning is that the community would run the process. The ideas would be generated by the community and the final funding decision would be in the hands of the community. And so we did one first successful pilot year with a general theme, and then they committed to 3 subsequent years with the theme of youth, newcomers, and then neighborhood spaces. Next slide, please. So similarly to Kitchener, we did not start off with in-house expertise, but we partnered with the Participatory Budgeting Project team out of New York. They're a really great resource. They have lots of really great resources to kick off a program. So they came to Victoria for a capacity building session with community and staff. And from there, we put out our first call for a community-based steering committee and got things rolling. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick overview of the last few years. So we've hosted 4 participatory budgeting processes. Over those 4 years, $200,000 has been distributed to 21 community projects. We've had a community-led steering committee each year made up of 8 to 10 community volunteers. And they're the ones that really have driven the process. They've written the rule books. They've decided beyond the themes have been set from council, but they've written all of the PB rule books and application guides and really set the course. So we have one city liaison that's been myself through most of the years, and we do also have some admin support as well. But it does take a fair bit of city resources. I'm a part-time support for this project, but throughout the year, it's a year-long process each year, and it goes from about 20% of my time to about 80% of my time, depending on the time of the year. So I mentioned the 4 themes. The first was projects that will improve life in Victoria. The second was around youth, newcomers, and the neighborhood spaces. And we've had one participatory budgeting rule book written the first year, and then the subsequent steering committees have updated it each year. Next slide, please. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time today speaking about our process from last year. So the theme was neighborhood spaces. Next slide, please. So we had 10 community volunteers, 1 city liaison, and 1 part-time city admin supporting the project. Next slide, please. I won't dive into this one. We've already gone through it, but in our context, it was that the steering committee themselves were designing the process. The community was brainstorming ideas. So we held information sessions and encouraged people to come together online and in person when that was possible to develop ideas. Community members then brought forward proposals to the city. Those proposals were then vetted first by this community-led steering committee and then by city staff just for viability. And then were taken out to the community for voting and then funding. And in our case, the projects were implemented by community members. Next slide, please. So this year, it was neighborhood spaces, and reconciliation was a really central, equity, inclusion, and reconciliation were central themes to what was important for the steering committee. And so before community members became involved in mapping out their own ideas, we invited them to either do an online or in-person tour of some places of significance to the local Indigenous communities to really ground their own ideas within the Indigenous context. Next slide, please. So this neighborhood spaces themes, the steering committee they had 3 separate categories. So physical space, social space, and virtual space. All the details are on our website, but this was set by the steering committee, not by city staff. Next slide, please. And the steering committee also developed project criteria. And so they wanted within each of those themes, you could then look to encourage social connection, encourage safety and belonging, foster community identity and expression, increase our connection with nature, or build community resilience. So projects needed to address one or more of the following criteria. Next slide, please. And they also set who could apply. So individuals, groups, or non-for-profits who live, work, or play in the capital region were able to apply. Projects needed to be based within the City of Victoria boundaries. The capital region is a larger region, but the projects needed to be based within our city boundaries, and businesses could not apply. Next slide, please. And they decided, so the total budget that was available for community projects was $50,000. There was an additional $10,000 to help run the community process. So that paid for any advertising or promotions that the steering committee wanted to lead, in addition to some dinners and supports for the steering committee itself. But within that $50,000, the steering committee decided that they wanted to have 3 categories to encourage smaller groups to apply, possibly for the smaller amounts, and then larger ones for some larger projects. So you can see that there was up to 1,000, between 1,000 and 7,500, and then up to 20,000. So next slide, please. This was the process. They asked everybody to read the proposal guide, and then steering committee members were available to have a pre-application conversation to answer any questions, and then individuals were to submit the proposal application and to complete a budget form. And then to submit the proposals and get everything all submitted to the city for vetting. So next page, please. This was what our proposal guide looked like. And it had all the information a community member or organization needed to apply. Next, please. We also hosted an information session because it was around neighborhood spaces. We had a representative from our Parks Food Systems program, a rep from Arts and Culture and Events, and from Transportation. And we also had 2 past recipients that joined in for the information panel. Next slide, please. This also dovetailed really nicely. The City of Victoria has recently launched a placemaking toolkit. And so this was a really great resource for people that were looking to develop ideas. They could open up this, and the city suggests different high quality park benches, for example, or different placemaking paints, for example, for doing murals and such. So that was a really great tool that we encourage people to use as they applied. Next, please. And this just kind of shows the flow. So it went over a year, and the projects, so this is basically what's important generally is that the process rolled through the year, and it was community voting in the fall, and winners were announced by the end of 2021. And this coming year, the projects will need to be implemented within the next year. Next slide, please. And this is a link to a video. I'll pop it in the chat, but it shows there were about 15 projects that came forward for vetting this year. 8 of them went out for community voting in the end. Next slide. And 6 projects were funded and are coming to life this year. So this is a photo of some of the participatory budgeting steering committee members and some of the recipients from this past year. So next slide. So I'll pop this link into the chat. engage.victoria.ca/PB is where the PB project page is, and you're welcome to jump in and have a look at the details. And if you do have any questions, you can contact me as well. So thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you, Melinda, Ryan, and Desiree, for your fantastic presentations. We are going to move on to our breakout sessions now, but before we move into our rooms, I'll go over what we have planned for these sessions. You're going to be automatically split into small breakout rooms. When you see the pop-up to join the room, please click join. When you arrive in that room, you'll work with a facilitator from the finance team to answer the question which you see on the slide here. What theme or idea do you think would make an interesting and effective participatory budgeting exercise for the City of Kingston? As a group, you'll share your ideas and the facilitator will enter those ideas into Mentimeter. These ideas will all be captured in our reporting out document that will be published on the Get Involved project page. You'll spend about 10 minutes on this exercise before moving on to a 5-minute session where you will rank your top ideas. When you complete the ranking, we're going to meet back into the main Zoom meeting. So please click that option to leave the breakout session when you see the pop-up. And when you return, we'll share your ranked ideas and have the opportunity for a brief reflection before we wrap up. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the breakout sessions.